years in a very acute way. And AUDA, which is the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, is an organization, is one of the oldest Palestinian-led Palestinian organizations in the U.S. It began before the last Intifada, the third Intifada began in 2000. It was initiated about a year before that. And we are one of the very few expressly anti-imperialist Palestinian organizations in the U.S. Now, not only has the American government been exporting a lot of the technology and tactics, well, the technology, I would say, finances and weapons to the Zionist entity known as Israel, but it has, and especially in New York, the NYPD has been importing a lot of the tactics that the Zionist government uses in the militarily occupied part of Palestine in the West Bank to use in New York. And our organization was a direct target of that program. And one of the reasons I was late and probably didn't give this the thought and time that it deserves, and I apologize to all of you and to the organizers and to my people for that, is one of those operations included the infiltration of our organization by two NYPD undercover agents, one of whom caused the entrapment of the first victim of the new New York terrorism laws, and he was sentenced just yesterday. So the Palestinian movements throughout the U.S. and throughout their history in the U.S. have always been punctuated by operations like this, dating back to the 70s. Operation, I think, Boulder, which, you know, Nixon specifically targeted Palestinians for deportation and arrest. And we're seeing that again now. We saw it, you know, in beginning 2001, right after 9/11, the first line of attack, I mean, along with many others, but the first line of attack and the first prosecution for a lot of the terrorism cases were Palestinian Muslim organizations. Slowly, we saw that shift beginning around 2009 to more left-oriented, anti-imperialist Palestinian organizations. And so our organization had been and continues to be on some level involved in coalition work and involved in the struggles that Monami and Berna discussed, but we've been very much struggling and now recovering, not just us, many other Arab and Muslim organizations, but specifically Al-Awda. And it was targeted around the same time that other Palestinian organizations of the same political perspective were being targeted across the US. And I'm going to talk mostly about what happens in Palestine and then bring it back, if that's okay, focusing on the role of women. So very big shift from what's being discussed. And I start with the assumption that we all have the understanding, of course, that Zionism is the military and colonial outpost initially of Europe, the British, and now the military arm and outpost of US imperialism in the Arab world and in the North African world. And so we can't talk about the Palestinian women's struggle without talking about Zionist occupation in all its expressions and in all areas of Palestine. And it extends beyond the borders of Palestine and actually follows Palestinians, as we see in the refugee camps and also in the United States. In the 48 territories, in the 1948 territories, what is considered the Zionist entity Israel, we see a combination of ghettoization, forced assimilation, which mandates the redefining to a large level of the Palestinian identity, and the continued alienation, exile, and institutionalization on all levels, cultural, economic, educational, the institutionalization of the inferiority of the Palestinian, and discriminations against Palestinians. And in Gaza, we see the full economic blockade and military siege, which extends to the waters, to the borders, and to the skies of the Gaza Bantustan is what it is, or prison. And in the West Bank, we have military rule and occupation, which is combined with expanding settler colonization. So looking at this and keeping this in mind, we see two overarching themes. First, that there is no state apparatus that is capable or interested in truly representing the Palestinians. And the closest that we have is the governing body in the Gaza Strip, and that is a government that is under war, under war and weakened and blockaded, and it very much depends on Palestinian committees for its own survival, and the Palestinian Authority, which is fully dependent on the Zionist and US governments, even protecting the Zionist occupation by oppressing, imprisoning, or further dispossessing the Palestinians, and itself is thereby another layer of oppression in the most clearly articulated way. To interrupt my own flow, I think what's relevant in this portion, in talking about Palestine, is what we have in Palestine is the ultimate crystallization of everything that Berna and Mon Ami discussed. I mean, this is imperialism in its rawest, most vulgar, open, obscene form. And so this is where we are either heading, or what, the product that imperialism is seeking to create. And so, I left off. Or as in the case of the refugees, and the Palestinian refugees are 2/3 of the Palestinian population, the largest refugee population in the world, and 2/3 of Palestinians are refugee, and they are fully stateless, and they're forced to rely on UNRWA. And UNRWA is a UN agency, right, which came into agreement with Western nation-state systems and heavily relies on US funding, which of course benefits from the dispossession of the Palestinians, but also conditions the funding to these stateless, unrepresented refugees who do not have land, conditions that funding on programming and education that mirrors the Zionist narrative. So when Palestinians or teachers in UNRWA-based schools and refugee camps teach about Palestinian history in a way that conflicts with the Zionist narrative, they are fired, and those classes are ended. And a lot of the programming that has included, whether it's youth education, youth support programs, that has supported a true Palestinian narrative, they are also being done away with. The second overarching theme is that the goal of Zionism and all of its institutions, the military, economic, social, educational, is the physical domination and confiscation of the land, and it accomplishes this by first colonizing and controlling the body of the Palestinian. So the body itself of the Palestinian is politicized. The natural human functions and regular acts of the everyday Palestinian are politicized, and everything from our existence, in the physical sense, to our origins, our identity, our faculties, all of these things are identified with one status, all the things that are identified with one status as a human being, and therefore, otherwise deserving of all the rights that come with being a human being, are also politicized. And here also in the US and in Europe, and certainly in Palestine, subject to the definitions of our nature, human or subhuman, and as were and still invoked Orientalist narratives, which are now joined by anti-Muslim and anti-other and Zionist narratives. And these dominate the Western world and justify not only the wars on Muslim and Arab nations, but provide the foundation and support for Zionist expansion and the cover for Zionist ethnic cleansing, grossly overt and public discrimination against Palestinians in Palestine and here in the US as well as their criminalization. So Palestinian women live under many layers of oppression, and the greatest oppression they suffer is a direct result of US imperialism and Zionist expansion. So it's a very rare, and I've never heard of a Palestinian women's group that does work without dedicating itself almost strictly, or at least primarily, i.e. if not wholly, to work against the various manifestations of Zionist occupation. And so that's always the heart of any Palestinian women's work. And so without romanticizing Palestinian resistance, and that's why I wanted to elaborate a little bit further on this politicization of the Palestinian person, so without romanticizing that, Palestinian resistance, in fact, and as a direct reaction to the goal of Zionist colonization and ethnic cleansing, the Palestinian resistance is anchored in the physical existence, movement, and articulation of the Palestinian identity and narrative. And that's highlighted by the fact that the very word Palestine and the Palestinian flag were criminalized in Palestine, but also in the US. When I first came to the United States as a child, my grade school teacher forged my report card, okay, you know, very clearly whited it out, because in my Christmas presentation I talked about how I came from Palestine, the land of Jesus. I'm a Muslim. This is my Christmas report on, you know. And it was only until, you know, the late 1990s and the beginning of the Intifada that the use of the word Palestine became a little more common even in academia. You know, it was very much not the case. So that reaffirms, you know, this kind of almost dogmatic concept, you know, existence is resistance, but literally, in fact, in the Palestinian case, that is the greater part of our resistance. And even without an analysis of it as such, this often falls on the women's shoulders as they physically navigate, you know, moving from place to place through Zionist-controlled spaces or under threat of death by Zionist war machines, to the simple amelioration or providing a sense of normalcy in the home. And a Palestinian home is certainly nothing that can be likened to what we experience. It is constantly punctuated on a daily basis by Zionist violence, whether it's the home raids at night or the tanks lurking or the checkpoints, attempts to eat or go to school. And so trying to create a healthy space is an act of resistance. Creating emotional spaces for joy and celebration, drops of normalcy for children and community, to managing the households in the absence, whether it's by murder, death, imprisonment, or other conditions that force the absence of the male head of the household. And the role of the women as conscious cultural carriers becomes all the more important. Monami elaborated a lot on that. Generally, their ability to pass Palestinian traditions, the herbal traditions, the medicinal, the folk stories, the folk music, and the most cherished folk forms of farming and consuming and using the land are not only resistant to the cultural arm of imperialism globalization, but also critical to safeguarding the very existence of Palestinians as people. So it's maybe not the most active form of resistance, but it is one of the most central ones. And this is affirmed, again, by the fact that as Zionist expansion grows, so do efforts to preserve Palestinian culture and traditions, and they see that as a major risk. Part of what we did in Al-Auda, you know, not only do they expand, not only do we see Zionist expansion on the ground, but we also see the appropriation of the Palestinian culture by the Zionist regime. So one of our most successful campaigns was to take back some of our cultural elements, and we had a campaign, "Don't be a foule," Israeli salad, the picture of tabbouleh, Israeli salad, "Don't be a foule," it's called tabbouleh. Things about Palestinian olive oil. The debkir, our form of dance, a traditional Palestinian dance, is being appropriated and sold as Israeli culture. And there's a lot to be said about what constitutes, the Israeli society is not homogenous by any means. And that's one of the problems that will likely lead to the implosion of the Zionist entity anyway. So a more interesting aspect of the role of women in the resistance is their role as protectors of the male members of society from Zionist violence. And this is a dual play on social pressures and consequences from Palestinian men that come from an Israeli's public physical attack on a woman and a manipulation of sexism and patriarchy. So whether it's at a checkpoint or in the course of a Zionist kidnapping of a Palestinian male or the uprooting of olive trees, Palestinian women are widely known and to some extent not expressly relied upon to physically intervene and often stop or at least delay that Zionist violence. My aunt, almost all of her children had been imprisoned, and so she had witnessed enough, and by the time she was in her late 40s, there were these rumors about her town. She married into a neighboring town, and the Zionist soldiers would say, "Don't go into this area because over there women eat ears." And so she was known every time they came to take one of her children, one of the neighbor's boys, she would bite their ears off. And this is really, I mean, maybe not the biting ears off part, but this is really common. The female intervention between Zionist soldiers and Palestinian males is very common. Turning to the economic life from factories to farms, and farming being one of the core elements of the Palestinian economy and Palestinian self-sustenance, Palestinian women have always been an integral and active part of the economy. So in the face of Zionist colonization and the lack of available land in an economic system that heavily relies on land development, combined with the increased feminization of Palestinian communities, by that I mean increasingly the male is absent, either in prison or in inaccessible other parts of Palestine, or out in foreign lands looking for work. So with that dynamic happening, especially in the refugee camps, Palestinian women have developed various alternative methods for economic self-sustenance. One of the most powerful being the Da'uniyat, which are cooperatives. And there's a direct correlation between the level of Zionist violence in a town and the number of cooperatives that exist in that town. And the cooperatives basically pool the human, land, and material resources to produce product or products either for consumption or trade or for the benefit of the community on another level. And it's an important form of economic independence, not only because they can stay, avoid the dangers of traveling through the checkpoints or starving when there are curfews, but it also creates, and their own economic independence, but it also creates a political independence, right, that allows them to move away from the charity-based neoliberal economic models that are pushed by the Palestinian authorities, by the US-funded NGOs, by the UN-based NGOs, and towards independent economic models, more natural economic models. And it'll also push, and in so doing, it allows them more space to not engage in the charity-based human rights or charity-based political work as well. So that they're, in their economic independence, they're more easily able to assert their political demands. And there's, Palestinian towns that have a plethora of the Da'uniyat tend to survive Zionist oppression more. Looking to modern political and armed resistance in Palestine, women have always played an active role in the sphere, dating back to the late 1800s. How am I doing on time? I'm sorry. Tell me how long I have. I won't be, I just want to know how long I should go into the history.
10 minutes or something.
Okay, so dating back to 1893, women were organizing and leading movements against some of the earliest Zionist colonies and against the British mandate and against British occupation. And by the 1920s, women's groups were hosting conferences internationally to educate neighboring Arabs about the impending Zionist colonization and what was coming. During the Nakba and before, women took up arms and trained, and they also did support work as they were trying to defend their towns against the Zionist militias massacres of the 48 territories. In 1936, which is the first intifada, before the establishment of the Zionist entity, women led and engaged in worker strikes. And that intifada had lasted for 6 months, and 600 female students organized a strike that in one part of Palestine, while another women's group protected and provided support for the fighters who were fighting at the time against the British, and who were working alongside the Zionist militias. I want to skip forward. So even to this day, of course, women, by participating in political parties, are also oftentimes receiving armed resistance training. So they're not just providing the support work, but they're present in all aspects of Palestinian resistance. So not only have Palestinian women always been present and representative, but they've always actively responded to their conditions in ways that relate as is needed at the time to the power structures in place, and in doing so, they've also challenged the internal power structures, oppressive power structures. And I'm not going to go on too much more. So just talking about challenges, you know, the greatest challenge that we're seeing in Palestine and in the Palestinian movement in the US, because our work is always mirrored, whatever's happening in Palestine can always be reflected in Palestinian-led movements in the US. That has always been the case. And so as the solidarity movement grows, and we have this influx of liberal support and almost a shifting of the Palestinian narrative to further garner that support and funding from those circles, we're also seeing a more narrowly circumscribed narrative and more narrow Palestinian demands. And we're seeing that not only in the US, we're seeing that in Palestine, and this was part of the Dayton Plan. So it's no coincidence that we're seeing that happen now. And this is then supported by the other layer, which is the government attacks here and in Palestine. In Palestine, the very same kind of trends that we're seeing being attacked and directly repressed by this government, we're seeing attacked by the Zionist entity. Those da'uniyat, the women's unions, the people that are doing grassroots work that allow women and people to be self-supporting, to be independent, to retain and hold on to the culture and the history and the information that allows them to survive without relying on neoliberal structures and corporate structures and whatnot. That's what's being attacked, especially most heavily in the past year. So I'll leave it on that note, and thank you all, and I apologize for my delay.